Imagine a single, deeply unsettling photograph. This image was taken in the year 1871 within the massive, intimidating stone walls of the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts. The girl captured in that frame is Catherine Doyle, only 9 years old. I urge you to look carefully at this image. Look at her eyes, the unnatural rigidity of her posture, and the profound expression that simply does not belong on a child's face. Catherine Doyle defied everything Victorian-era doctors knew, or thought they knew, about the human mind. Her case remains utterly inexplicable to this day, more than 150 years later. This photograph captured one of the most disturbing and haunting medical mysteries of the entire 19th century. What happened to Catherine Doyle cannot be explained by modern medicine. It cannot be explained by psychology, and perhaps the truth can never truly be understood. This is a story that goes far beyond any ordinary medical case. It is a narrative that questions the very limits of human reality. To truly grasp the horror and complexity of Catherine's case, we need to transport ourselves completely back to the world of 1871. America was still reeling, still recovering from the deep scars left by the Civil War, which had ended just 6 years prior. Boston was a city undergoing massive transformation, its crowded streets filled with Irish immigrants who were fleeing hunger and extreme poverty in their homeland, desperately seeking a new life in the New World. Psychiatric medicine itself was in its most primitive and brutal beginnings. Asylums were nothing more than dark, isolated places where people considered mentally disturbed were literally hidden from society, locked away from public view. There was no real clinical understanding of mental illness, psychological disorders, or the complexities of child development. Anything that didn't fit into the narrow boundaries of social norms was simply locked away and forgotten. The Danvers State Hospital, where Catherine would spend her final brief years, was one of these deeply sinister institutions. Built on land that previously housed Salem farms, it carried not only the stigmas of primitive, unscientific medicine, but also the dark, haunting echoes of American history itself. The long, imposing corridors of that place had witnessed treatments we would consider outright torture today. This included prolonged cold baths, extreme physical restraint, total sensory isolation, and morally questionable medical experiments. It was within this oppressive and scientifically limited environment that Catherine Doyle became one of the most documented and deeply disturbing cases in 19th century psychiatry. It is crucial to remember that the doctors of the time, however well-intentioned they may have been, simply did not possess the conceptual or technological tools to begin to comprehend what they were observing in this child. Catherine Doyle was born on March 15, 1862, in the very heart of Boston. She was the daughter of Patrick and Mary Doyle, two devoted Irish immigrants who had come to America with the simple hope of finding a better life. Patrick worked a grueling job as a longshoreman at Boston's busy port, loading and unloading the massive ships that brought goods from around the world. Mary worked as a domestic in some of Beacon Hill's most elegant homes, cleaning and cooking for Boston's elite families. The Doyle family lived modestly in a small 2-room apartment in the North End, a neighborhood that was predominantly Irish. Living conditions were precarious and difficult, but the community was strongly united by their Catholic faith and the shared, difficult experience of immigration. Catherine grew up surrounded by the beautiful, comforting sound of Irish spoken by her older neighbors, the warm smell of homemade bread from local bakeries, and the rich folk stories her maternal grandmother told her about old Ireland. By all available accounts preserved in family archives and parish records, Catherine was an absolutely normal child during her first 7 years of life. She was playful, curious, and intelligent for her age, but entirely within the expected parameters for a girl of her social origin and era. She played happily with rag dolls made by her mother, helped with simple household chores, and attended Sunday Mass at St. Leonard's Church, where she learned basic prayers in Latin. The parochial school teachers described Catherine as a dedicated student, though not exceptionally brilliant or unusual. She learned to read and write at a normal pace, showed interest in biblical stories, and related well with other children. There was absolutely nothing in her behavior, development, or personality that suggested the earth-shattering events that were about to come. Mary Doyle, in later painful interviews with the doctors, always emphasized that Catherine was simply her sweet girl, a loving child who enjoyed helping her mother in the kitchen and worried sincerely when her father came home late from work. Patrick described his daughter as the light of our house, a child who brought simple joy and normalcy to a life that was otherwise marked by the harshness of urban poverty and hard labor. Then, in September 1869, all this changed, so dramatically and suddenly that even to this day, doctors and researchers fiercely debate what truly happened to Catherine Doyle in that fateful month. On the morning of September 14th, 1869, a Tuesday that Mary Doyle would remember for the rest of her life as the day she truly lost her daughter, Catherine woke up different. Not physically. She had the same appearance as always, the same round, freckled face, the same curly brown hair, the same small stature of a 7-year-old girl. But something fundamental, something deep within, had changed during the night, something that went far beyond mere physical appearance. The first signs were subtle, yet alarming. Catherine woke up later than usual, which was uncommon for a child who had always been a natural early riser. When she finally came down for breakfast, she moved differently, more deliberately, more calculated, as if each step was being carefully planned and executed. More disturbing still, she didn't greet her parents with the usual warm, "Good morning, Mommy," and "Good morning, Daddy," that were a daily routine in their family. Instead, Catherine simply sat at the table and stared fixedly at her parents with an expression that Mary would later describe as empty, yet at the same time very, very old. When Mary, trying to hide her fear, asked if she was feeling well, Catherine answered, but her voice had changed. Not dramatically, but enough to be deeply noticeable. It had a rougher, more mature quality, as if it came from someone much older than her 7 years. In the weeks that followed, Catherine's transformation became utterly impossible to ignore. She began demonstrating knowledge that a child of her age and limited social background simply couldn't possess. During family meals, she made casual comments about historical events with impressive, shocking precision. She spoke about the American Revolutionary War as if she had personally experienced it, mentioning obscure details about specific battles that weren't taught in the basic parochial school she attended. And even more disconcerting, Catherine began showing a deep familiarity with ancient Greek philosophy. She quoted Aristotle and Plato, not like a child who had merely memorized phrases, but like someone who genuinely understood complex philosophical concepts. When Patrick, confused and frightened, asked where she had learned these things, Catherine just smiled. That cold smile her parents began to fear deeply, and replied that she had always known these things. Catherine's religious knowledge also expanded inexplicably. She began reciting complete passages from the Bible in Latin, not just the simple prayers she had learned in church, but obscure passages from the Old Testament that most priests needed to consult in books. When Father O'Brien from St. Leonard's Church tested her knowledge, he was shocked to discover that Catherine could discuss complex theology with the depth and understanding of an advanced seminarian. But perhaps the most disturbing knowledge of all was the insight Catherine demonstrated about the people around her. She knew intimate secrets about neighbors and family acquaintances, information no one had shared with her. She casually mentioned marital problems between neighborhood couples, secret financial debts, and even moral indiscretions that supposedly no one knew about. While Catherine's impossible knowledge was disturbing enough, it soon became clear that her transformation had much darker, more sinister aspects. She began demonstrating a morbid interest in death and suffering that was completely alien to the sweet personality she had shown during her first 7 years of life. Catherine began asking detailed, specific questions about how people died. Not the simple, natural curiosity of a child about mortality, but specific, technical questions about execution methods, medieval torture, and fatal diseases. She described with frightening accuracy the torture practices of the Spanish Inquisition, assassination methods from ancient cultures, and even detailed Egyptian mummification techniques. Most alarming was that Catherine seemed to take pleasure in these dark descriptions. Her eyes would shine when she spoke about suffering, and she would smile in a way that made the adults around her feel a deep chill down their spine. It wasn't the innocent smile of a child, but something calculated, almost sadistic. Besides, Catherine also developed a deeply disturbing relationship with physical pain. She began deliberately hurting herself, scratching herself with her own nails until she bled, biting her lips until they were raw, hitting her head against walls hard enough to leave visible marks. But most frightening was that she showed absolutely no distress during these episodes of self-mutilation. On the contrary, she seemed to be in a state of ecstasy, as if physical pain brought her some kind of incomprehensible pleasure. Mary Doyle tried several times to prevent these behaviors, but Catherine always found ways to continue hurting herself, using loose nails in the walls, pieces of broken glass, and even kitchen utensils. And when questioned about why she did this, she simply replied that she felt like it or that something asked her to do it. Catherine's behavior toward animals also changed drastically. Before, she had been gentle. After the transformation, animals began actively avoiding her. Dogs would bark when she approached, cats would flee, and even birds seemed to avoid flying near her. When Mary, heartbroken, asked why the animals acted so strangely, Catherine replied with that cold smile she had developed. "They know what I am now, Mommy. They're smarter than you." As the months passed, Catherine's case evolved beyond simple behavioral and intellectual changes. She began demonstrating physical capabilities that simply shouldn't have been possible for a child of her age and physical constitution. The first notable manifestation was her disproportionate strength. Catherine, who had always been a small, physically normal girl, suddenly could break objects with surprising ease. During a fit of rage in December 1869, she snapped a solid oak chair in half using only her hands. Patrick, who worked with heavy wood daily, examined the broken chair and was utterly perplexed. The wood had been broken in a way that would require considerable force, far beyond what any child could generate. On another occasion, Catherine left impressions of her fingers permanently engraved in the family's wooden kitchen table. These were not superficial scratches, but deep marks, as if her small fingers had the hardness and pressure of metal tools. Mary tried to sand the marks away, but they were too deep, remaining as a disturbing reminder of her daughter's inexplicable strength. Catherine also began demonstrating abnormal physical resistance. She could stay for hours in uncomfortable positions without showing fatigue or discomfort. Once, Mary found her standing in the center of the living room at 2 o'clock in the morning, completely motionless, staring fixedly at the wall. When questioned, Catherine said she had been in that exact position since dinner, more than 6 hours, without moving once. Then, Catherine's resistance to cold was particularly impressive. During Boston's harsh winter of 1869-1870, she frequently went outside wearing much less clothing than the weather required, apparently impervious to temperatures that made other neighborhood residents shiver. On one memorable occasion, Patrick found her sleeping in the snow-covered backyard, wearing only her nightgown, showing no signs of hypothermia or discomfort. But perhaps the most disturbing physical manifestation was the change in Catherine's eyes. Several neighbors and family acquaintances began commenting that there was something wrong with her gaze. They described her eyes as having a hypnotic, almost predatory quality. People who looked directly at Catherine for prolonged periods reported feeling dizzy, headaches, and an inexplicable sensation of fear. Mary noticed that Catherine's eyes sometimes seemed to change color depending on light or her mood. Normally brown, they sometimes appeared almost black, particularly during her most disturbing episodes. On some occasions, Mary swore she could see other shapes moving in the depths of Catherine's pupils, as if something else was looking through her daughter's eyes. As Catherine's behavior became increasingly disturbing and inexplicable, Patrick and Mary Doyle did what any desperate parent would do. They sought help everywhere possible. As devout Catholics, their first recourse was the church. Father Timothy O'Brien of St. Leonard's Church had known Catherine since her birth. He had baptized her, supervised her first communion, and had always considered her one of the sweetest children in his parish. When the Doyles sought his help, He initially hesitated to believe the terrible stories they told. Surely, he thought, it was just a difficult phase exacerbated by the worried imagination of loving parents. This perspective changed quickly when Father O'Brien met with Catherine personally. During a pastoral visit in January 1870, he tried to talk with the girl about simple religious matters. To his profound shock, Catherine not only demonstrated extraordinary theological knowledge, but also began questioning fundamental aspects of Catholic doctrine with sophisticated arguments he rarely heard even from advanced seminarians. Even more disturbing, Catherine demonstrated knowledge of intimate details about the priest's personal life that he had never shared with anyone. She mentioned sins from his past, doubts about his faith that he kept utterly secret, and even specific events from his childhood in a small Irish town. When the priest, shaken to his core, asked how she knew these things, Catherine just smiled and replied simply that she knew many things about many people. Aye. Convinced he was dealing with something far beyond common medical understanding, Father O'Brien decided the only course of action was to perform an exorcism. The ritual was conducted at the Doyles' house on a cold February 1870 night, with only the family and an elderly deacon present. What happened during this ceremony was so disturbing that Father O'Brien never spoke publicly about it, mentioning only in his personal diaries discovered decades later that it was the most terrifying experience of his entire priestly life. During the exorcism, Catherine did not react as religious manuals suggested a possessed person should react. She showed no agony, didn't writhe, didn't scream, or blaspheme. Instead, she laughed, a loud, echoing laugh that seemed to come from multiple voices simultaneously. And then, to the priest's absolute horror, she began reciting the exorcism ritual along with him, word for word, in perfect Latin, anticipating each line before he even pronounced it. After the failed exorcism, the Doyles turned, despairing, to medicine, hoping that science could offer explanations that religion had failed to provide. They sought out Dr. Henry Morrison, one of the few Boston doctors who specialized in mental disorders. Dr. Morrison was a meticulous man, known for his rigorous scientific approach and detailed documentation of clinical cases. When the Doyles sought his help, he initially approached Catherine's case with a healthy professional skepticism, assuming he was dealing with an exceptionally intelligent child suffering from psychological trauma. This perspective changed drastically during his first sessions with Catherine. The doctor conducted examinations over 2 intensive weeks in February and March 1870, meticulously documenting every aspect of the girl's behavior and capabilities. His reports, which survive to this day in Boston's historical medical archives, make truly disturbing reading. Morrison immediately noted that Catherine demonstrated intelligence far superior to average, but directed almost exclusively toward morbid and disturbing subjects. She could discuss human anatomy with precision rivaling medical students, describe rare diseases with exact symptomatology, and even suggest medical treatments that were at the forefront of medicine at the time. During sessions, Catherine constantly drew and wrote, but her artistic creations weren't the flowers, houses, or animals typical of children her age. Instead, she produced detailed images of anatomically correct human skeletons, scenes of death and decomposition, and human figures in positions of extreme agony. Her drawings were technically proficient in a way that shouldn't have been possible for a child without formal artistic training. Second, Dr. Morrison was particularly intrigued by Catherine's writings. She wrote fluently in several languages she had never studied, including Latin, ancient Greek, and even rudimentary Egyptian hieroglyphs. When asked where she had learned these languages, she simply replied that the words came to her when she needed to use them. But what most disturbed Dr. Morrison were Catherine's eyes. In his reports, he wrote extensively about the inexplicable sensation he had when looking directly at her. He described the experience as deeply uncomfortable, comparing it to the feeling of being analyzed by an intelligence much older and more experienced than should exist in such a young mind. The doctor also documented several physical anomalies during his examinations. Catherine's body temperature was consistently lower than normal, but she showed no signs of hypothermia. Her pulse was abnormally slow but regular. More strangely, plants in his office began to wither and die when Catherine was present for prolonged periods. even when all other environmental conditions remained constant. The event that finally led to Catherine's admission to Danvers Hospital happened on a particularly cold February 1870 night. It was an incident so bizarre and inexplicable that it convinced even the most skeptical doctors that Catherine needed immediate specialized medical care. Patrick Doyle woke at 3 o'clock in the morning with a strange, heavy feeling that something was wrong. The house was too quiet, and he noticed the air seemed particularly cold, even considering it was the height of Boston winter. He got up to check on the family and discovered that Catherine wasn't in her bed. After searching the entire house without finding her, Patrick looked out the kitchen window and saw a small figure standing in the snow-covered backyard. Catherine was in the center of the yard, completely motionless, wearing only her thin, white cotton nightgown. She was in the middle of a snowstorm that had begun during the night, and her body was already partially covered with snow. What shocked Patrick most was Catherine's position. She was standing with her arms extended toward the sky, as if embracing the storm. Her head was tilted back, looking directly at the night sky, and she remained completely still, despite the strong winds and heavy snow. Patrick ran outside, expecting to find his daughter in severe hypothermia or worse. But when he reached her, he was shocked to discover that despite having been in the storm for several hours, Catherine wasn't shivering or showing any signs of discomfort from the cold. Her skin was ice cold to the touch, but she was breathing normally and seemed completely conscious. When Patrick tried to bring her inside, Catherine slowly turned to look at him. What he saw at that moment would haunt him for the rest of his life. Catherine's eyes were completely black. Not just dilated pupils, but completely black, as if there were no visible iris or white. And when she spoke, her voice echoed in a way that seemed to come not just from her throat, but from the very air around her. She looked directly at Patrick with those impossible black eyes and said words he would repeat to doctors for the rest of his life. "The stars are almost aligned, Father, and when they meet in the correct position, you'll finally understand that Catherine never really existed. She was just preparation for something much more important." The morning after the backyard incident, after a sleepless night and several hours of desperate discussion between Patrick, Mary, Father O'Brien, and Dr. Morrison, the most difficult decision of the Doyles' lives was made. Catherine would be admitted to Danvers State Hospital. The decision wasn't taken lightly. Everyone involved recognized they were dealing with something beyond their understanding. Father O'Brien admitted that his spiritual resources had proven inadequate. Dr. Morrison confessed he had never seen a similar case and needed the infrastructure and resources of a specialized institution to have any hope of understanding Catherine's condition. For Patrick and Mary, surrendering their only daughter to medical authorities was a decision that destroyed them emotionally. But they recognized that Catherine represented a danger not only to herself, but potentially to others. Her demonstrations of supernatural strength, impossible knowledge, and increasingly disturbing behaviors created an unsustainable situation. Danvers Hospital was chosen because it was considered one of New England's most advanced institutions for treating mental disorders. Under the direction of Dr. Elias Hartwell, the hospital had implemented some of the most modern techniques of European psychiatry and had resources for extensive medical documentation. On the morning of March 15th, 1870, exactly 1 year after her 8th birthday, Catherine was taken from her Boston home to Danvers Hospital. She cooperated completely with the process, demonstrating a strange understanding of the situation that was far beyond her apparent age. During the carriage ride to Danvers, Catherine remained silent most of the time, looking out the window with that ancient expression that had become her distinguishing characteristic. Only once did she speak, turning to Dr. Morrison, who was accompanying her, and said, "You're going to try to photograph me, aren't you, Doctor? It will be interesting to see what your camera can capture." Danvers State Hospital was an imposing and threatening institution built in the Gothic Revival style. It had been built following the principles of so-called moral treatment, a philosophy that promised cure through routine and a controlled environment. In practice, Danvers Hospital had become a repository for people society considered incurable or too dangerous to live in freedom. When Catherine arrived in March 1870, The hospital housed more than 600 patients in deplorable conditions. The long, dark corridors constantly echoed with disturbing sounds. Screams, the metallic noise of keys and chains, and the constant murmur of incoherent conversations. The institution's chief physician, Dr. Elias Hartwell, was a 52-year-old man dedicated to studying mental disorders. When Catherine was brought to his office for the mandatory initial examination, Hartwell expected to find another common case. He had read Morrison's reports but maintained skepticism about the more extraordinary claims. This perspective changed drastically in the first minutes of his interaction with Catherine. She didn't demonstrate the anxiety typical of new patients. Instead, she examined the office with calculating eyes, as if evaluating Dr. Hartwell himself. Before Hartwell could even begin his routine examination, Catherine surprised him by mentioning specific details about 3 patients who had died recently at the hospital. She knew their full names, dates of death, and intimate details about the circumstances that had led to their deaths. Information contained only in confidential medical files. Even more shockingly, Catherine demonstrated knowledge of personal secrets about Dr. Hartwell himself. She mentioned specific events from his childhood, controversial professional decisions, and even aspects of his marriage. When Hartwell, visibly shaken, asked how she could know these things, Catherine simply smiled with that cold smile and replied that she had ways of knowing things about interesting people. Initially, Catherine was placed in the hospital's pediatric ward. Catherine's presence in the pediatric ward quickly became problematic, not for the reasons the medical staff anticipated. Catherine wasn't violent, but she exerted a strange and inexplicable influence over the other children. Within a week of her arrival, 3 children who had been stable began demonstrating completely new and disturbing behaviors. They stopped participating in activities and spent hours sitting silently, staring fixedly at the walls as if seeing something adults couldn't perceive. A 6-year-old girl began talking obsessively about a shadowy figure. A very tall woman dressed completely in black, with long dark hair, and eyes she described as dark holes. Most disturbing was that all the children who began demonstrating these strange behaviors described exactly the same figure. Sister Margaret, the nun supervising the ward, realized these children also began demonstrating Catherine's knowledge. They spoke about events from Catherine's life before her admission, and even described details about the Doyle family house in Boston, places none of them had ever visited. A boy who had been mute suddenly began speaking fluently about Catherine's childhood in Ireland. The children began acting in a coordinated manner as if following invisible instructions. They moved in specific formations, sat in geometric configurations, and sometimes spoke in unison, reciting words in languages none of them had studied. Dr. Hartwell, observing these developments, began to suspect that Catherine was somehow influencing the behavior of other children. After 6 weeks, he made the difficult decision to transfer Catherine to an individual room in the hospital's isolation section, not for violence, but due to the inexplicable influence she exerted. The isolation room was a Spartan cell. The transfer marked the beginning of a more intensive phase of observation. Daily therapy sessions quickly took on an unusual character. Instead of responding passively, Catherine frequently took control of conversations, directing them toward territories that made Hartwell deeply uncomfortable. She asked penetrating questions about his private life and deepest insecurities. Catherine demonstrated a disturbing ability to identify people's psychological vulnerabilities and exploit them with surgical precision. During a particularly memorable session, she confronted Dr. Hartwell about a traumatic event from his childhood that he had never mentioned to anyone: the accidental drowning of a girl named Sarah Mitchell. Catherine described the incident with details that exactly matched Hartwell's memories, including the weather and his feelings of guilt. More disturbing than Catherine's impossible knowledge was the way she used this information. She employed it as precise psychological tools, manipulating the emotions of those around her. Dr. Hartwell began meticulously documenting other anomalous phenomena. The temperature of her room was consistently lower than the rest of the hospital, a difference of 4 to 6 degrees C. Plants placed near her window would wither and die within days. Medical staff reported severe headaches, nausea, and vivid nightmares only after working in her section. 2 guards requested transfers after reporting constant sensations of being watched. During the summer and fall of 1870, Dr. Hartwell implemented an experimental study program that went far beyond standard medical protocols. Catherine was subjected to evaluations normally applied only to highly educated adults, including complex logic tests and philosophical analysis. In all tests, she demonstrated capabilities far beyond what should be possible. He presented her with photographs of people she could never have known and texts in dead languages. In each case, Catherine demonstrated surprising familiarity. Without any contextual information, she was able to provide the full name, family details, cause of death, and personal habits of an unknown man who had died 10 years earlier. Hartwell investigated and confirmed all the information was completely accurate. Catherine also began demonstrating what Hartwell described as premonitory capabilities. She made specific predictions about future events that invariably came true with disturbing accuracy. She predicted the death of 3 specific patients in the hospital, mentioning not only when but also the exact circumstances of their deaths. In all cases, her predictions proved completely accurate. Although Catherine's mental and supernatural capabilities seemed to be intensifying over time, her physical condition began deteriorating worryingly. She lost weight dramatically, appearing almost skeletal. Her skin became pale and translucent. Her hair began darkening and becoming thicker, assuming an almost abnormal quality that resembled animal fur. More disturbingly, Catherine began demonstrating periods of complete physical rigidity that lasted several hours. During these episodes, she remained completely motionless like a statue. Dr. Hartwell discovered that these periods of rigidity coincided with the most intense supernatural manifestations. The room temperature dropped drastically. Objects moved more frequently and intensely. Catherine also began speaking during these periods, but her voice assumed qualities different from her normal speech. Sometimes she spoke with multiple voices simultaneously. Other times her voice assumed tones that were clearly adult, as if other personalities were speaking through her. During these episodes, she described historical events that had occurred centuries before her birth and made predictions about future events that invariably came true. In May 1871, after more than a year studying Catherine, Dr. Hartwell made a monumental decision. He would photograph her as part of his medical documentation. Hartwell had noticed that Catherine seemed literally different to different people. On some occasions, she seemed exactly what she was, a 9-year-old girl. On other occasions, especially during her periods of rigidity, he felt he was looking at something much older and more powerful than a human child. Hartwell hoped a photograph could objectively capture Catherine's real appearance. He hired photographer James Thornton. The photography session was scheduled for the morning of June 15, 1871. When Thornton was taken to Catherine's room, he immediately noticed something different. The quality of light seemed strange, as if natural light was being absorbed or distorted. Catherine watched Thornton set up his equipment with interest, but without the typical curiosity of a child. She remained completely motionless and silent, knowing exactly where to look before he gave instructions. When Thornton instructed her to look at the lens, he felt an intense physical sensation, as if something invisible had passed through him. The room temperature dropped drastically and instantly. He had the clear sensation that he wasn't just photographing Catherine, but something much larger and more complex working through her. During the 15-second exposure, he maintained eye contact and experienced the sensation of being photographed by her while simultaneously photographing her. When the photograph was finally developed, the image was simultaneously exactly what they expected and completely different from anything they could have anticipated. Catherine's eyes in the photograph seemed to be looking directly at whoever observed the image. More strangely, they seemed to have impossible depth, as if the photograph had captured infinite layers behind them. Observers reported the sensation that they could fall into those eyes if they looked too long. The photograph was as if the camera had captured an expression that was slightly out of phase with reality, revealing something that was present but normally invisible. Vague and indistinct shapes seemed to move at the photograph's edges, as if other presences had been captured in the image along with Catherine. The photograph became an object of intense fascination and debate. All consulted specialists agreed that the image showed anomalies they had never seen before. Theories ranged from technical defects, which were discarded, to neurological conditions affecting her physical interaction with the environment. Dr. Sinclair suggested she might be producing anomalous bioelectric fields. Another doctor suggested she might be suffering from an extreme form of multiple personality disorder where different personalities physically affected her appearance in ways the camera could detect. After the June 1871 photography session, Catherine's condition deteriorated rapidly. She began spending increasingly longer periods in states of catatonic rigidity, extending for entire days. During these prolonged catatonic states, the supernatural phenomena around Catherine intensified dramatically. Her room temperature frequently dropped to levels that formed ice on windows. Objects moved with greater frequency and violence. Medical staff members reported hearing voices whispering in unknown languages and seeing shadowy figures. Sister Margaret requested permanent transfer, writing, "Whatever is happening to her is spreading beyond her room, and I fear for all our safety." Catherine entered her final catatonic state in September 1871. She remained completely motionless for 6 consecutive weeks, not eating or drinking. Medically, she should have died of dehydration, but somehow continued living. She remained conscious and alert, her eyes following people around the room. Catherine Doyle died on the morning of November 2, 1871, at 9 years old. Dr. Hartwell reported that her death was strangely peaceful. At the exact moment of her death, the room temperature rose abruptly to normal levels for the first time in months. Catherine's autopsy revealed physical anomalies. Her internal organs were in perfect condition, with no signs of disease. Her brain showed neural development patterns that were completely atypical. More strangely, Catherine's body didn't decompose in the expected manner after death. It remained in remarkable preservation for weeks. Even after she was buried, plants refused to grow in the earth directly over her tomb. Decades after Catherine's death, researchers continued studying her case. In 1923, the famous psychologist Carl Jung examined her photograph, suggesting Catherine might have been an extreme example of synchronicity, a focal point where normally separate psychic realities converged. Modern theories suggest extreme temporal lobe epilepsy or extreme savant syndrome. But even the most sophisticated theories struggle to completely explain the physical aspects of her case. When we look at Catherine's photograph today, we continue to see what the doctors of the time saw: an image that is simultaneously familiar and deeply disturbing. Her eyes seem to contain an intelligence and experience that transcend her apparent age, and her expression suggests knowledge that a 9-year-old child shouldn't possess. Her story reminds us that human experience can be much more complex and mysterious than our current scientific models can explain. It challenges our tendency to explain everything within familiar frameworks. Catherine Doyle lived only 9 years, but her legacy continues to challenge and inspire researchers more than a century after her death. Her story reminds us that the world still contains profound mysteries, and that some questions may be more important than their answers.